Welcome to Seminars at Steamboat. I'm Joella West, Seminars Chair. This is it, the seventh and final event of our 2021 season. Not exactly the season we foresaw in August 2020. It turns out that we're much better at identifying future subjects of interest than we are at predicting public health. However, because we had no reason to deal with travel schedules and costs, we've been able to bring you an expanded season of 7 nonpartisan talks by experts addressing each of the topics that we identified a year ago. Next week, our all-volunteer board will be meeting to fill the whiteboard with ideas for 2022, when we plan to be back, yes, in person, at the Strings Pavilion here in Steamboat, yes, with our popular Friends Dutch Treat dinners to follow. Thanks to our board for continuing faith in this season that it could be successful despite having to return to the virtual format. Special thanks to board member Ken Spruill for handling the technology interactions with speakers and board members. He somehow made it all look easy, even when it wasn't. Thank you to our executive director, Deb Metcher, who takes care of everything we need all year round. Thanks to KUNC, Community Radio of Northern Colorado, for promoting our season and for making each of our talks available on their website at kunc.org's seminars podcast landing page. And thank you to you, our audience, for your donations, which allow each season to be free to the public, which is an integral part of our mission. If you enjoyed this season, you can help us prepare for 2022 by making a contribution now or at any time on our website by clicking on the donate button at the top of your screen. And please visit seminars in the off-season to view past events and get a first look at plans for the 2020 season. One important reason for the success of seminars is what we learn from you. This week, you will be receiving our annual audience survey, which is an online one-page questionnaire. Please take a moment to complete it. Your answers really do make a difference in the choices we'll make at the end of this month. Thank you to today's sponsor, City of Steamboat Springs. And finally, thank you to David Lamb at Edward Jones, whose generosity has made it possible to caption each of this season's recorded talks. As always, our speaker will take audience questions following the presentation. We encourage you to submit your questions at any time. Just click on chat, which appears at the bottom of your page. Today's speaker is Camille Busette, and here to introduce her is board member Linda Mae Morrison.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Joella. We're delighted tonight to welcome Camille Busette, who is the director of the Race, Prosperity, and Inclusion Initiative at the Brookings Institution. The initiative focuses on issues of equity, racial justice, and economic mobility for low-income communities and communities of color. Prior to joining Brookings, Camille was an executive at the World Bank, where she led its financial inclusion innovation arm, working globally with financial service executives on regulatory, data, and cybersecurity issues. Camille was the first CEO of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's Office of Financial Education, where she initiated research on financial well-being and was a member of the policy and executive management teams. She has worked on behalf of low-income populations at the Center for American Progress and with organizations that help people manage their money in order to improve their financial health. You can read more about her extensive and impressive career on our website, seminars@steamboat.org. And as Joella said, let me remind you also that you can ask questions via the chat link that you will find at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to post questions at any time during her presentation. After Camille has finished her talk, I will moderate the Q&A session. Please join me in welcoming Camille Busette, our 7th and final speaker of Seminars at Steamboat's 2021 season. Camille?
Thank you, Linda, for that very, very kind introduction. Good evening, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. I especially want to thank my colleague, Belle Sawhill, for extending an invitation to me to engage with all of you. I'm really looking forward to our discussion, but before we do that, I'm going to address the concepts, some of the concepts that underpin modern day racial dynamics in the US. And first, I'm going to speak to you about space and the importance of space and racial dynamics in the US, because I believe space plays a unique role in the ways in which racism and discrimination are reinforced, negotiated, and contested in the US. Second, I'm going to discuss the importance of slavery as an institution for understanding disparities in wages and wealth. So very light topics there. But first, I want to start with a video. So give me a moment. I'm going to share my screen and we'll watch the video. It's a little bit under 2 minutes, and then we're going to go into the talk. So I'm going to get out of here. So I wanted to start with that video because I think it really encompasses a lot of the concepts that I'm going to be talking about today. So as I mentioned, one of the key themes for this discussion is the concept of space, and the space I'm referring to here is obviously not outer space, but it is the physical, cultural, and historical space. So if you remember nothing else from this discussion, I do want you to remember that space has been and continues to be on the front lines of race relations in the US. So from slave ships to plantations to the Jim Crow era, when statues recognizing Confederate heroes were erected, to Plessy versus Ferguson, lunch counters, buses, and more recently, Starbucks, Yale University dorms, immigration detention centers, enforcing white supremacy in everyday life has relied heavily on concepts of who can be where, whose ambit is free, and whose is deeply constrained. The concept of space and the regulation of space serves to remind everyone where you are welcome and where you are not. And depending on who the you is, you will find you are welcome everywhere or almost nowhere. We are all familiar with the incident that took place in 2018 in a Philadelphia Starbucks. Two young entrepreneurs, African-American, were waiting to meet a professional contact when one of the Starbucks employees called the police to remove the men who were, it turns out, doing nothing more than sitting and waiting. With the advent of citizen journalism, we were all able to see what happened. And these young men were handcuffed by the police and removed from the Starbucks while other Starbucks patrons and the man who those entrepreneurs were meeting contested the police action. While Starbucks ultimately apologized, settled with the men for $1, ran their employees through anti-bias training, and fired the employee who had called the police, the fact remains that the message was clear that Starbucks employees singled out those two young men because they were Black, and it took it upon herself to make the judgment that they were in the wrong place, and that the space in Rittenhouse Square did not belong to them, and that she had the authority and power to enforce the type of segregation of space that has been the norm from the moment slave ships arrived here over 400 years ago. We have seen similar kinds of things happen since 2018. And there's a whole genre of, living while Black videos. Where are you welcome and where are you not? This country has a long history of telling Black and brown people that they do not have the right to occupy a range of physical spaces. That history has shouted, "We do not want you here." After the Civil War, in particular during the Jim Crow era, many hundreds of statues commemorating Confederate heroes were erected in public squares, on streets, in office buildings and schools, where office buildings and schools were named after Confederate leaders, all to say to freed men and women that this is still our space and we will do with it what we like, and we do not want you here, so you are not welcome here. An interesting fact, an economist at the Economic Policy Institute has shown that the rate of African American voting is today lower in places that have a preponderance of Confederate street names and statues than in places that do not have those attributes. That Jim Crow set of cultural practices around the regulation of space became more formalized in the 1920s and 1930s in several ways. First, it became common to erect signs that regulated the occupancy of physical space. Signs that said no Negroes or no dogs, no coloreds, or there's a colored entrance in the back, etc., continued a long tradition of the regulation of Black and brown people in public and private spaces in the US. Second, residential covenants, which specified high value to low value real estate tracts, enforced spatial segregation throughout cities and towns in the US, redlining as it's known, still exacts a price today. Most African Americans who do own homes, the market value of which is lower than that of similar homes owned by white families. And my colleague Andre Perry has done a lot of work on this in Brett Brookings. And for those who do not own homes, many live in areas that have been decimated by decades of disinvestment and neglect. Third, Blacks in particular were subject to terrorism. So lynchings and the Tulsa race massacre of 1921 are previous examples of terrorism. And in the modern day era, police bias, racial bias in policing is another example of terrorism. As it turns out, this is an especially effective way of regulating space. And as you know, until relatively recently, segregation existed in schools, universities, in workplaces, and exclusion from certain professions and from unions were the norm. All of that has added up to where we are now, a place that has regulated physical as well as historical space. When we look at our history, our official history as a nation has routinely excluded the contributions of the original Americans, of African Americans, of Asian Americans, and Latino Americans. And it is because that official history has been so exclusionary that we need to have museums such as the National Museum of African American History and Culture dedicated to showcasing specific histories and contributions. People of color are not seen as part of the tapestry of official US history. So we need to understand how our regulation of space and who regulates it perpetuates inequities throughout our society. When you tell people they are not welcome somewhere, when you build schools that look like jails, When you treat Black and brown preschoolers and typical teenagers as criminals, you are clearly saying you do not belong here. When you over-police, so Black neighborhoods tend to have far more aggressive policing than white neighborhoods, you are also regulating space. And the impact of that regulation of space has consequences. According to the US Census, in 2019, 18.8% of African Americans were living in poverty. And this was the lowest rate observed. This was absolutely the lowest rate observed since poverty estimates were first produced for this group in 1959. So it's almost 20%. The corresponding poverty rate for whites for 2019 was 7.3%. In addition, today there is a significant racial wealth gap where white households have 8 times more wealth than Black households. Moreover, our criminal justice system preys heavily on Black families. Black boys have on average a 1 in 3 chance of being incarcerated, and in some cities it's much higher than that. And while many state judicial systems have moved away from non-unanimous juries, some, like heavily Black Louisiana, still retain them, a vestige of ensuring that African Americans do not move too far away from a life of incarceration and therefore separation from whites. We know that whites are more likely to use drugs in the United States, but Blacks are more likely to be arrested and convicted for possessing drugs. Regulating space is a very American phenomenon. We have created Indian reservations, camps for Japanese American citizens, and cages for young children coming from Mexico's Central and South America. The results are rarely good and never in keeping with we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now I want to turn our attention to the institution of slavery. As we know, this was an especially brutal form of servitude, and there were some key elements which today shape some important dynamics in the US economy. So let's start with the basics. I think it's well known that enslaved African Americans were not paid for their labor. That's the whole premise. And that this has been the central point of discussions of reparations for Black Americans. Even after the Civil War, African Americans remained in virtual servitude as poorly compensated day laborers. This has set the stage for a consistent trend in racial wage dynamics in the US. In the US, we know that there are many, many disparities in wages and pay. Women, on average, earn 80 cents to every man's dollar. People who only have high school degrees, on average, earn less than those with some college. But there are notable persistent race-based disparities as well. In 2019, African American women earned on average 63 cents for every dollar earned by white men. African American men, on average, earned 75 cents for every dollar earned by white men. But fewer African American men are in the workforce. They tend to experience the highest unemployment rate in the US. Race-based disparities in pay exist all the way from hourly labor to career professionals. And it turns out that having a college degree does not, on average, for African Americans, and particularly for African American males, net the same type of financial gains that it does for white Americans. So where does that leave us? The combination of spatial segregation and the acceptance of the fact of unequal pay, based on attitudes about the value of people, can lead to public policies that produce unequal and discriminatory results. But how do we know when public policies are racially unjust? Sometimes it's pretty easy, and sometimes it's really not easy. So, for example, there tend to be many African American neighborhoods in the US that are close to toxic waste dumps or railroads or some kind of undesirable and unhealthy industrial edifice. That seems fairly straightforward. That kind of persistent pattern seems like, okay, there's something going on there that is race-based. Likewise, schools, public schools that are in predominantly African-American neighborhoods also tend to perform more poorly. They tend to be more poorly resourced. Overall, just have they don't serve their students very well, serve their students very poorly. That again seems to be a vestige of racial dynamics and pretty racialized policies in the school systems. There are more complicated examples of racial injustice. And those complicated examples include, for instance, credit scores. So we think about credit scores as fairly neutral, where basically credit scores are determined by, an algorithm. But what's interesting about algorithms is that, particularly for credit scores, is that they assume that everybody starts off at the same place. You have to, if you're going to use an algorithm. Everybody starts off at the same place. And some people engage in behaviors, this is the assumption, some people engage in behaviors that make their financial lives very difficult, and others engage in behaviors that, reward their financial decisions. But it turns out the initial assumption that everybody starts out in the same place is obviously flawed. Credit scores reward your ability to pay. Your ability to pay is based on income and wealth. If you're starting on the back foot on both of those things, it's going to be very difficult for you to do well in the kind of credit scoring system that we have. Another example of a more complicated policy that, you're not really sure what's going on there is the Black wealth deficit more generally. So we're at a point now in the United States where African Americans get college degrees. Some of them go on for graduate degrees. Some of them, work, many, many hundreds of thousands work in private industry, et cetera. And you would expect that at some point, the racial wealth gap would close. We haven't seen that. We haven't seen the racial wealth gap close to any appreciable level. So there's a set of policies having to do with finances, with the wages that you're paid, with the way you're remunerated, with the kinds of benefits you get at jobs, et cetera, that don't end up being equivalent for African Americans and for other folks. So there are a number of policies which, on the face of it, could look very neutral. There are others that are clearly racist, but we know that in the public policy space, we're going to have to sort through a range of public policies for whom the outcome turns out to be racially unjust. One of the interesting things that one of my colleagues at Brookings has looked at is that despite the consequences of the regulation of space in the US and the disparities in income and wealth, is that African Americans and Latinos, when they are surveyed on their levels of optimism, tend to be much more optimistic than white Americans. It's a very interesting finding, and it's consistent. She's been doing these surveys for years, and it's consistently that way. So one of the things that I think about when I do my work is how do we build on this optimism that is always there, that African Americans and others really buy into the American system and the American dream. So how do we build on that optimism? How do we create a sense of belonging in all spaces after more than 400 years of working extremely hard to say that you do not belong? We do that, I think, by challenging ourselves to imagine a future where space, both literal and figurative, is the province of all. So to effect change, when we think about policy, do we start with outcomes like the racial wealth gap, like the fact that African American men are less likely to be in the labor force? Or do we start with belief systems? Or do we do them both? I think we are at a very interesting inflection point because now we're seeing public policy leaders step up and try to work on both the belief systems and the outcomes. So some examples of belief systems are changing street names or names of institutions, getting rid of Confederate statues. Some examples of outcomes, working on outcomes, are the latest iteration of the Payroll Protection Program, which is really targeted on sole proprietor minority businesses. So there's an attempt to change the outcomes for those folks. A lot of legislatures, state legislatures, are thinking about changing criminal statutes for drug possessions. And then, of course, there's both a local level, but also a national conversation about reparations. So that's a focus on outcomes. So the question is, how do we imagine a future where this legacy of spatial regulation and this legacy of tolerance of real disparities, consistent disparities, racial disparities in pay and in compensation and wealth exist? How do we reimagine that future, and what role do policies play in our ability to address both the belief system and the outcomes? I'm going to stop there, and I welcome a very robust discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille. That was very provocative and gave us a lot to think about. But I want to ask you a question about that video. That looks to me like microaggressions. When we clutch our purse a little more closely, when we pass an African American on the street, when we take our child and move the child from one side, from one hand to the other hand, when we pass somebody. Could you address the microaggressions that we all see every day but don't recognize as such?
Sure. I mean, I think, one of the interesting things about just being human is we develop a sort of little code book in our heads that tells us this is dangerous, this is not, this is risky, this is not. And what I think is unfortunate and enduring in the US system is that we have attached a very negative set of attributes to African Americans, but particularly to African American men. And so I think what that video does is it really demonstrates, here's an African American man. You can't really tell that he's a professional as you first, encounter him. But the sort of almost sort of primitive reactions are to be on guard. And I think that says a lot about our history and how we have, over time, have thought about particularly African American males as scary and violent. And so when I think about making changes in our, public policy changes, I always in the back of my head, I always think, but we also have these cultural beliefs that, manifest themselves in what we call microaggressions.
I want to ask a question about the impact that discriminatory policies have on other people besides the minorities at whom they're targeted. Because it seems to me that everybody gets impacted by racially discriminatory policies. Could you address that, please?
Yeah, I think that is a really excellent insight. And the way I think about that is in a couple of different realms. So on a more localized level, when you have redlining, for instance, which, unfortunately has affected lots and lots of cities in the US, what that does essentially is it creates zones that are really highly disinvested, in which there's a lot of disinvestment. And when you have that, that means those zones cannot be open to everybody. Like no one wants to go there, right? So you're limiting the real estate, literally. You're limiting the real estate that's available to everybody. And if you have enough of those kinds of places, then your the actual real estate, like housing and residential real estate, tends to be limited to very specific areas. And that means your the cost of housing can really be driven up because you don't have the larger, supply, so to speak. So I think of it that way in terms of limiting what is valuable and also limiting other areas that people could, really be living in and enjoying themselves in, et cetera. And of course, redevelopment is meant to address that. Gentrification does address that, but not in ways that are, particularly positive. I also think about our economy generally. And whenever you have discriminatory policies, that means that not everybody is able to reach their full potential. And when you're thinking about the US economy in a competitive global space, we compete with China and India and everybody else, to not have 20% of your population reaching its potential, let's say, or slightly more than that, I think it ultimately limits the economy as well. It limits the local economy, meaning it limits the consumer-driven economy locally, but it also limits who we are as Americans functioning in the economy and functioning in a global economy. So I think there are lots of negative elements to having a discriminatory system in the US.
As you might imagine, there's several questions on critical race theory.
Oh,
So
yes, of course.
Could you please address the negative orientation and the political divide that seems to be surfacing with critical race theory?
Sure. I think it's, well, first of all, let me just say that critical race theory is essentially taking a fresh look at a range of statistics and research and history, et cetera, and evaluating where it is that racial dynamics have been imprinted on that history. That's basically what critical race theory is. So people who misunderstand the intent think that critical race theory is really about blaming whites, current day white people, for the outcomes that we see. But in fact, what it is meant to do is it's meant to broaden the intellectual palette with which we analyze events and outcomes.
So how do we get people comfortable with critical race theory? There seems to be so much division about it.
No, I think that's a great question. And I actually, I'm actually one of these people that feel like it's okay if some people aren't comfortable with it. I think it currently is, it's a stand-in for people's discomfort with all things that are focused on opening doors for a range of folks who are not white. And I think it's a signifier of discomfort with discussions around equity. So it's never socially acceptable to say that you don't want equity, but it has become somewhat, in some circles, acceptable to say we don't want critical race theory. So I think of it as masquerading and trying to cover for another set of attitudes that have to do with equity. And so, I'm one of those folks like, well, if people don't like critical race theory, that's fine. But the main thing is we want folks to understand that it's important when we think about policies, we think about, policies with a small p and with a big P, that we think about the importance of equity and making sure that we are providing an equitable solution in whatever those policy domains are.
Do we need to rename it, critical race theory, to something else to make it more palatable to people?
I think that would be one way to do it. I think critical race theory, the notion of critical, right, is obviously coming from academe, where it has a certain valence. But I think to think about it as just sort of adding another set of tools to the way that we think about history in the United States and current events, I think is probably a more palatable and maybe less provocative way of thinking, of treating the same type of subject matter.
So we've got young people watching this right now, and two of them are curious to know whether or not you feel that racial relations have improved or degraded during your lifetime.
Okay, so I'm 58 years old. So I was born in 1962. So, that's a pretty long swath there. And it's interesting. I've had this very same conversation with my son, who's almost 16. And in my view, things have improved, but I don't think they've improved to the degree that they should have in 58 years, I guess is probably how I would put it. So, we are not sitting at the back of buses, so this is a good thing, but that we should never have been doing that. But we are, but we may not be sitting at the back of buses, but it's still difficult for African Americans and other folks of color to make inroads in boardrooms, to executive management, to be able to be considered competent if they get into, or excellent if they get into top schools. Most people think, oh, it's affirmative action, or they cut some deal for you or whatever. So I do think that we've made a lot of strides as a country, but this is an evolving picture, and in my view, has evolved a little too glacially for where we really should be.
Another question is being asked about how the federal and state governments should address space as a concept. How do they do that in implementing policy? That's
a great question. I'll deal with it in two parts. So like locally and at the state level. So I think there are lots of opportunities, particularly now, to think about our environments, or the built environment, and how that built environment either helps us thrive or doesn't help us thrive. And so I think a lot of people know about environmental justice. I would expand that concept to think about the built environment and make sure that when we're thinking about rebuilding things or having development projects, et cetera, that we are thinking about how to make sure that everyone in our community is enjoying the same things, bike lanes, or parks or recreation centers, and that they all are they're evenly distributed and they're easy to get to, et cetera. So I think just rethinking the whole built environment, I think, is important, and it's actually a fairly, I think, current thought now when we particularly, this is where I want to address the federal level, particularly now when we're thinking about a huge infusion that has to do with infrastructure. So when you're thinking about an infrastructure bill, the one that's passed the Senate is really about more traditional infrastructure. But when you think about traditional infrastructure, think about how many highways or railroads or electric transformer farms are sitting in communities of color. And you can think about replanning that and rezoning, redeveloping, replanning where those things are, or just eliminating them completely. So I think there are lots of opportunities now to think about the built environment, particularly with the what's likely to be a very large infusion of federal money. So in terms of the federal response to the built environment and to spaces, the federal government, of course, has always been on the forefront, EEOC, et cetera, Justice Department, working on a lot of the legal aspects of spatial segregation. But spatial segregation is really cultural. And I think to the extent that in housing policy, again, in infrastructure policy and environmental policy, we take into account the voices that aren't always at the table. I think that's going to be very important to making sure we actually turn the corner on the regulation of spaces in a way that is enduring, sustainable, and allows people to thrive. That's one thing. Then there's a whole conversation around policing. And policing is, if nothing else, is sort of the raw definition of how you really regulate space. That and zoning. So those are the two areas where I think at a local level, we have a lot of opportunity. We also have a lot of resistance, but I think we have a lot of opportunity to think about, when is it appropriate for us to have a heavy hand with the police? When is it appropriate to have really restrictive zoning, and when is it not appropriate? So when is it that those two things collide with allowing communities of color to thrive, and when is it that they don't? So, and having a really robust discussion that involves the folks who are affected, I think is very important.
So do different parts of the country experience spatial inequality differently?
I think that yes, that is absolutely true. I think overall, I would say the U.S. is pretty much a leader in spatial regulation, but there have been some recent reports which have shown actually that the Northeast is probably the most segregated in terms of housing and that sort of thing. That the Southeast is the most regulated with respect to using the criminal justice to regulate activity and space. And then the other parts of the country, like Colorado, have a little less of that, with particular cities in particular areas having maybe higher levels than maybe their state does. So for instance, Peoria in Illinois, Racine in Wisconsin, higher levels of that kind of regulation than you might have in the overall state.
Well, it's interesting, that Steamboat Springs, I think, has a minority population of give or take 12 to 14%.
Mm-hmm.
So in a community that has such a small minority population, how do you deal with those kind of issues in that kind of a community?
That's a great question, and I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear from our viewers on this. But to me, I think the main thing is we have to make sure that whenever we are making decisions, so if those are urban planning, city planning, economic development decisions, that we have as many voices as we possibly can at the table. And sometimes that's going to mean reaching out to that 12% of the population and just making sure they're included in those discussions, those decisions, and they're informing whatever those plans are. I think that is the most important thing. I think the thing that we really that sometimes we miss is we're in a space with people we know and we trust, and we don't ask ourselves who is not here. And I think asking that question, particularly in like the context that you just mentioned, the smaller places that don't have these huge populations, just asking who is not here and making sure you're proactive around that, I think is very, very important.
There are some issues that I think bear some exploration. So how do you explain if and when politics may have affected policies in areas such as welfare reform or public housing or schooling, even transportation?
So, the question is it politics versus just, structural racism? I think is that the setup.
Does politics play a role, or does it not? How does that impact?
No, politics I think is exceedingly important when you're talking about policies. Politics is basically how do you pull together a coalition to get what it is you want done. In the U.S., sometimes those coalitions have included people of color, and they're very important to actually getting a policy done. And sometimes they have not included those folks. So politics, the art of the possible, is really the art of pulling together those coalitions. And it's very, very important to public policy. That's how you get a lot of things done, except for regulatory action. It's pretty much how you get a lot of things done. So when we're thinking about transportation or housing policies at the local, state, the federal, all those levels, it's about, do you have enough votes, enough of a coalition in the people who are like-minded to be able to pass your policy or get it to a point where you want it to get to, or do you need to bring in other people? And so where policymakers bring in communities of color, it's because they need them politically to do that. So I think politics is actually an important part of policy generally, but policy is undergirded by a set of values. So those values kind of shape what the discourse is going to be. They shape what the shape, essentially, what's the art of the possible. And so you start with the values, you start with that foundation, you devise the various policy options, and then you put together your coalition and you use that coalition to get the policy done. But the policies are based on a foundation that has to do with values and what we consider important and who we consider important in this country. And so policy is a result of those values plus the actual, coalition building. And that's how we get the policies we have.
So one of our viewers acknowledges that the United States is becoming more and more diverse. I think we can see that even in advertisements where you see interracial couples in many ads these days that you never saw anything like that before.
Right.
And so the question is, which of the various racial disparities should we focus on first?
Oh, that's it's a very good question. And it's one that I think sort of ended with, which is, where do you focus on outcomes? Do you focus on the attitudes that lead to those outcomes? So to me, from a very pragmatic perspective, in this country, if you really want people to be able to reach their full potential, you start, I think, with the disparities between Black males, Black boys, and Black males, and everyone else. So in the US, when you look at all our statistics, Black men and Black boys end up less likely to fulfill their potential than everybody else, except for Native American men and boys, who also fare extremely poorly and who also have very, very similar kinds of experiences in the US. So to me, you focus there, you start exploring why that is the case, and you focus your policies on trying to eliminate those disparities. By definition, because Black men and Black boys live in families, you're going to have to deal with, how do you actually create a path forward for their families to do well? How do you support them in school? How do you make sure that school, home, et cetera, all those are very nurturing environments? And how do you make sure that as they progress through life, that they are supported and nurtured and able to take advantage of good jobs, good education, good jobs, housing opportunities, et cetera. So I think that's where you start, because those are the folks that, at least from a data perspective, are the ones who are showing the most amount of distress, and the ones for whom that distress has been extremely longstanding.
You mentioned families just a moment ago, and I think many people don't understand the talk that Black parents have with especially their sons, their Black sons. And so could you address the talk and explain to us how that manifests itself and how you talk to your young people about what might be out there that they might face?
Sure. I mean, I think there are different versions of the talk depending on, who you are and where you're situated. But I would say that at its very most basic, the talk is really about, the world is not created equal. You will not be treated with respect. And you should expect that the outcomes you might see for white people are not going to be the outcomes that you're going to experience. And in fact, when you are in an encounter with the police, it's highly likely that your life will be on the line, which is not going to be the same for, a white young person apprehended by the police. It's extraordinarily difficult to convey to young people like tweens and teens who are really at the apex of their self-confidence, which is just normal for that age group, that something devastating could happen to them despite their best efforts. And so the talk is really about, in some ways, brutally and very cruelly bringing down that self-confidence and saying, yeah, if you get handcuffed and you're, end up in jail, that might actually be a good outcome because it would be better than being killed. It's unfortunate, but it is, as we've seen with George Floyd and a range of, a whole host of other individuals who we've lost over the last few years, but it is actually a reality. And so I think Black parents like myself are very careful to make sure that their young people, particularly their young men, are aware of this as a possibility and know how to conduct themselves should they get into, a position where they are interacting with the police in a non-positive manner.
Well, you might not be surprised to find out that there are questions about voter suppression. So
Yes.
would you please address the issue of voter suppression and how it's manifesting itself in almost every state in the country?
Well, right. So, I tend to be a little more philosophical about this, and I think maybe others might be. So we just witnessed a very historic election where the turnout was incredibly robust, and particularly robust in some of these key swing states, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, et cetera. And whenever you have something that you have an outcome that doesn't meet with the expectations of those who are in power, they always try somehow to make sure they regain power. This is kind of I would say, a dictum of politics. I used to be a student of communist regimes that had transitioned to democracies, so way back in the 80s and 90s. And it turns out that when people lose power, they don't like that. And they try in a variety of different ways to regain that power. So in some places, it's very authoritarian, other countries. Here we do it by passing laws that try to suppress and make sure that people of color in particular are not voting. What is interesting about some of these laws that have been passed is that they may end up suppressing votes across the board, making it very hard for particularly people in rural areas, for instance, to get out and vote. So I think it will be interesting to see what actually is the outcome. I think the intent of a lot of these state legislative reforms is obviously to suppress votes, but it'll be very interesting to see if that actually happens. And particularly in the context of a changing demographic picture, whether or not in some subsequent legislative session, those aren't repealed.
Well, we have a question from your colleague, Isabel Sawhill.
Okay, I know it's going to be a tough one.
I don't know. You'll have to be the judge of that. She says you've done a lot of work on social capital, and so how social networks are segregated. And so the question is, can you talk about some of that and talk about the consequences of those?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Belle, thank you very much for the question. So what I did with another colleague of mine, Richard Reeves, who you might know, is we wanted to know if people's connections, their social connections, whether or not that had any impact on economic mobility. So what we did, just very briefly, is we interviewed hundreds of people in 4 different locations, tried to make those samples as representative as possible of those 4 different locations. So they were San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Racine, Wisconsin, and Charlotte, North Carolina. And what we asked people was, when you want to find a job or a housing opportunity or an educational opportunity, who do you turn to? And then describe those people to us. So what we found once we collected all the data, analyzed it actually quantitatively, is that social networks that are related to economic mobility, so to getting a job, changing your housing situation, or getting more education or training, those kinds of networks are highly racialized. So whites tend to have only whites in their networks. Blacks have mostly blacks, but have a few sprinklings of others. Latinos have mostly Latinos, but they also have sprinklings of others. So it tends to be relatively racially homogenous in this country. And we also found that white men, of course, were the most networked, and white women less so, Black women less networked, but most poorly networked were Black men. And so what that all means is that when we're thinking about economic mobility, we're thinking about how do people get ahead, how do they get good jobs, et cetera. The networks within which you're enmeshed are very, very important to how you end up from a financial and economic perspective. And so if your networks are small or very constrained, not particularly broad, and they only include a few people who are, could really be helpful to you, then you're going to have very limited opportunities. And so we saw with Black men that they typically had one network connection for all those things. And we think part of the reason for that is that they are very highly regulated. They're regulated everywhere. They're pulled out of school at much higher numbers. They tend not to be employed, et cetera. They tend not to be in college. Places where you form these networks, they tend not to be there, and pulled out for various different reasons. So what that means is, these are folks who are not really plugged in to the kinds of networks that allow for that opportunity. But more importantly, from a policy perspective, when policymakers make policy, they make assumptions about the transmission mechanisms of that policy. So, for instance, if you were the person who first put together the payroll protection program for, in the initial months of COVID, you would have expected that you put out, you kind of blanket the airwaves with that announcement, and that people will, hear that, and then they'll apply for these payroll protection programs, right? So it turns out that you need to be embedded in the social network that actually can convey that information. People who were not in a social network that could convey that information didn't apply for those programs. So they had subsequent versions of it, and the most recent version of it under the Biden administration really explicitly targeted sole proprietor, minority entrepreneurs and business owners, because they realized, somehow the knowledge about these programs, about the payroll protection program, just isn't filtering through. And one of the reasons for that is that those folks are plugged into very different social networks.
So how do you build allies? Who do you collaborate with to get some progress?
In terms of social networks?
Yes.
Yeah, so social networks are all about who you feel comfortable with. And you can't really force people to be together, but when you have more, less segregated residential space, for instance, there's an economist at Harvard that has, Raj Chetty is his name, that has essentially demonstrated that less segregated places, residential settings, tend to lead to better economic mobility outcomes for African American boys in particular, but generally for African Americans and other racial minorities. So if you have less segregated housing, then you are likely to have outcomes that are overall better in terms of social networks. And when you think about zoning, when you think about how people are really, a lot of people might be thinking, I love my neighborhood. I don't want a, multifamily building here. So you want to think about how do you make changes in zoning laws so that people who own single family homes feel like it actually enhances their property value. So there are a lot of different, I think, ways of approaching this, but I do think residential segregation is one very important thing. And then making sure that schools also have a very diverse population is also very important, because that's where people tend to form their social networks as well.
On a broader scale, what about organizations like the Industrial Areas Foundation and their efforts to try to bring communities together and force public policy at the local level? Are they effective?
Well, I think some of those are very effective, and some of them, it just depends on who ends up being participant in the conversation and informing those conversations. But I think any effort that's made to make sure that there are lots of diverse voices is always going to be welcome, and it's always a very important way of broadening those social networks.
Well, you might be interested, of course, in the fact that that 15-year-old who's watching, who I told you about a few minutes ago, now wants to know, what is it you hope for your 16-year-old? What do you tell him?
So, great question. First of all, I hope he has a normal year, but I don't know, how likely that is. And I hope my 15-year-old viewer also has a very normal school year. But what I really do hope is that for all young people who are in those age groups, that they really are able to live in a place where everybody really can just meet their aspirations, that there really isn't a difference in educational quality between one community and the next, that people are able to get a job, whether their name is, Jason or Deshaun, whether, that they're able to afford to go to schools without racking up a huge student loan debt. I really want them to be able to thrive, and, for my son to be able to have every option open to them without somebody, saying that, this isn't something this isn't a place where we think you should be. And I just want to have the opportunity for them to have those broad range of opportunities, and also to be in a position where they see a lot of people like them in similar kinds of occupations, in similar kinds of settings, and that where there really just isn't a lot of emphasis placed on race.
What about mentors? How important are mentors to the underserved population?
Well, mentors are important to everybody, right? Everybody, I think, benefits from having a mentor. There have been a lot of studies of mentorships, particularly for more underserved populations, and the quality of the mentorship really makes a difference. So if the mentor is really focused on the total person, is in there for a very long time, so there's a very strong relationship, that mentor can be very influential in unlocking social networks that other individual may not have had. So that can be very good. But mentorships that are more like, I'm going to have you as an intern for a quarter, and then you're going to go on your way, and there's very little emotional and relationship investment, those tend to be not as successful.
How do we judge success? How do we know when we've made it?
In this
Space.
in terms of mentorship?
Not just mentorship, but in the space of discrimination and attitudes of people towards people who are different from them. How do we know when we've reached a goal? What are the milestones that we might look for?
Yeah, so that's great. I actually think that one of the things we should be looking for is making sure that we don't have, when we do not have any more disparities in education or employment outcomes, we will have essentially made it. I think those are lagging indicators of discrimination, and they say a lot about our attitudes. And if we get to the point where there are no disparities, really, we'll be in good shape. Like just when we think about the unequal pay for unequal work between men and women. We will have made it when there are no more disparities. Women earn 100% of what men earn.
Well, as a final question, I might want to ask you about how to get more people to understand that enabling one group doesn't necessarily mean taking things away from another group. This zero-sum game that we seem to be playing, if you win, I lose. How do we get people past that notion?
You know, that's a fantastic question. I don't know who asked it, but one of the things I think about is our national narrative, which is very much based on individualism. Like, you know, for instance, the reason I'm successful is because I did all these things myself. That is a very damaging narrative. So for people who tend to be successful, you look back and you think about how many, you know, how their social network functions for them, how connected they are, how many resources they have, how it really is a group effort. And so when I think about folks who feel as though this is a zero-sum game, I think they haven't reflected enough on how they have moved forward, that in fact, most of the reason that they've moved forward is because other people have done things for them. And so when we think about that, you know, when we think about, you know, all of us in that context and think about how each individual really deserves to be able to have those kinds of, the kinds of guidance, the kind of support, et cetera, reflecting on how you got where you are, I think will help open people's minds to realizing it's really not a zero-sum game. It's all about all of us kind of supporting each other.
So do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with us before we thank you very much for a very provocative and interesting conversation?
I just want to say a huge thanks. This has been great. I am sorry I wasn't there in person and we couldn't do it in person. I think that would have been extremely exciting and exhilarating. But I very much value you having come and listened to this and your interaction. I want to thank the seminars at Steamboat immensely for the opportunity, and particularly you, Linda, for your excellent moderation of this conversation.
Thank you very much. And to everybody, thank you once again for joining us for our final discussion at Seminars at Steamboat. It's been a pleasure being with you this season, and Camille, it's been a particular pleasure to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.